Welcome to Darien Library. Thanks for coming out on this gorgeous evening. I would like to just take a minute to thank our friends of Darien Library. They are the people that make events like these possible, and we are always so grateful and indebted to them. Tonight's guest has worked in publishing, most recently as Senior Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Hyperion Books, digital media, also as the founder and CEO of Cookster.com, and as a journalist writing for various publications, including the New York Times and the South China Morning Post. He's on the board of the Kingsborough Community College Foundation, and he is also the co-author with David Shipley of Send, Why People Email So Badly and How to Do It Better. But tonight he is here to discuss his New York Times best-selling memoir, The End of Your Life Book Club. And this was a work that Slate magazine called Touching and Rigorously Honest. And over Memorial Day weekend, I actually had a patron come up to me and tell me she was very excited about tonight's event, and she had listened to the book on audio, but she found that it was not a great book to listen to on audio because she kept having to pull over to write down the books that he was talking about. So it was taking her a very long time to reach her destination. Please join me in welcoming, we are so excited to have him here, Mr. Will Schwalbe.
Wow, thank you, Erin, for that very nice intro. And I love the story of the patron who had to pull over. And thank you all for coming tonight. What a gorgeous day, and also what a gorgeous part of the world you live in. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. This sort of seems to roll in and roll out. I'm just gonna put it in. So I wanted to start by saying how incredibly delighted I am to be doing an event here at the Darien Library. Libraries have played an incredibly important role in my life, and part of the joy of traveling around the country, and I've been on perpetual book tour since October 2nd, has been visiting libraries and meeting great patrons of libraries such as yourselves, meeting the amazing staff and people who are so committed to places like this, and also meeting so many wonderful booksellers and seeing the role that great bookstores and great libraries play in communities. I think an amazing thing about a book is that a book has no place. It exists in the words on the page or the words on the screen and in your mind. But we all need places. We need physical spaces to come and be introduced to books and meet each other and hear about what's going on and share something of ourselves. And libraries and bookstores play such an important role in that. It's funny, I used to say to people when they say, what's the greatest gift you can ever give anyone? And I would say, the greatest gift is a book. And then I realized that that actually wasn't true. That books are the second greatest gift that you can give anyone. The greatest gift I think you can give anyone is the conversation you have about a book. When you share something of yourself and they share something of themselves, and you're able to learn more about the people around you and the world around you. And that, of course, is one of the things that happens in libraries and great bookstores. Now, as many of you probably know, The End of Your Life Book Club is a book about the books that I read with my mother when she was dying. But it's also a book, I think, about how books tell us what we need to do in our lives and in the world. So I'll be talking a little bit about the book, and then I'll read a short passage, and then I hope we can have a lively discussion, questions, hopefully some answers, and that you'll also maybe share with me and everybody else some of the books that have been most important to you in your life and that have helped bring you closer to people in your life. So about my book, here's the background. In October 2007, my then 73-year-old mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that had already spread. Stage 4B. This is very often fatal within about 3 to 6 months, but my mother actually lived for almost 2 years. Now, during this time, as you can imagine, our lives became really populated with visits to the doctor, with tests, and visits to chemo. And over these almost 2 years, my father, my brother, my sister and I, all took turns going with Mom to these various appointments, as did many of her friends. But as it worked out, I very often went with her to chemo, and we always talked about books, as we had all our lives. And right away, I realized that we'd actually formed a very peculiar little book group, one with only 2 members, a mother and a son. In fact, when I had this realization, I said to my mother, you know, if we keep meeting like this and keep talking about books, it's kind of like a book group. And her immediate reaction was, don't be silly, it can't possibly be a book group. And I said, really, why not? And she said, there's no food. So I said, okay, this will be the world's only foodless book club. The book that I wound up writing was about the conversations that we had, what I learned from her, and what we both learned from the books we'd read, which ranged very widely from books like Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. That was a book I'd always pretended to have read, but never actually had. To books like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. We read John Updike, we read Alice Munro, we read Geraldine Brooks, Jhumpa Lahiri, Khaled Hosseini, Thomas Mann, Marilyn Robinson, poets like Mary Oliver. We read mysteries, we read self-help, the occasional cookbook. We really read the way ordinary people do. This wasn't, there's a limited amount of time left, let's only read capital G great books, or let's work our way through the Loeb Classical Library, or read the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is, we've read all our lives. Mom wanted to keep living right up until she died, so let's keep reading. And we read books that people gave us. My mother was incredibly thrifty, so if you gave her a book, she would definitely read it. And as in most book groups, we talked. And we talked about things very big, like courage and faith and death sometimes. And we talked about not so big things, like writing thank you notes and the importance of shelf liner. I think it might be generational, but my mother was just obsessed with shelf liner. She thought that putting your clothes in a chest of drawers without shelf liner was barbaric and somewhat akin to eating off the floor, but she never sold me on the whole shelf liner thing. So the book tells those stories, but it also tells the story of the one last really big thing my mother wanted to do before she died. And that was, she wanted to raise enough money to help an extraordinary woman named Nancy Hatch Dupree, whom she'd met in her travels, build a research library and cultural center in Kabul, Afghanistan. And this was something that Afghanistan hadn't had since the Soviet invasion. And she also wanted to create hundreds of book boxes that could go to villages throughout Afghanistan so that people who had never seen a book in their own languages, Darien Pashto, and often never even seen a book at all, could learn, and that they could learn in their villages. Now, before I tell you more about that, I think I should probably tell you a little bit about my mother. When I was growing up, my mother had been an educator. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she was director of admissions at Radcliffe and Harvard when I was growing up there. Then she became, my parents moved back to New York, where they were from, and she became a guidance counselor at the Dalton School. And then she became head of the high school at Nightingale, which is a prominent girls' school in Manhattan. I should also add that I have very deep roots in this area because my grandmother lived in Westport, Connecticut. Her second husband, who I adored, was the golf pro at Longshore. And I have spent so many wonderful, happy summers and time with my grandmother here, well, many, many years at Longshore hanging around. Somehow I never got to play golf. I always wound up in the pro shop fixing carts, or pretending to. But this area for my mother, for my father, and for me has very deep resonance. So that's the background. That takes my mom to her mid-50s. And then, when she was in her mid-50s, she had a complete change of life. And what happened was this. One day, she's head of the upper school at Nightingale, a postcard arrives, a mysterious postcard. And this is what it says. Dear Mary Anne Schwalbe, I am a nun on the Thai-Lao border. I need your help. And my mother wrote back to Sister Mater, how can I help? And it turns out Sister Mater was at a refugee camp called Ban Vinai. And Ban Vinai had 45,000 Hmong refugees. And it had a center for severely disabled refugee children. And this nun ran the center. And she was writing Mom to say that there was some coloring book or educational book or something that she needed. And it cost about $15, but with the currency and this, it was just impossible to get. And would my mother buy it for her and send it to her? So my mother did that. And what started was 2 years of correspondence between Sister Mater and my mother. We need $15 for this, we need $30 for that, we need $20 for this, we need $40 for that. Mom got the girls at Nightingale involved. They were using their crayons and doing drawings for the children drawings for Mom's students. All was going swimmingly. And one day Mom got a letter from Sister Mater saying, our water treatment plant just broke. Can you send a check for $13,000? And my mother wrote back, not cross, but quite a formal letter saying, I really want to help, but I just can't afford to send you $13,000. And immediately came back a letter from the nun saying, I am so sorry. I'm a nun in an order with a vow of poverty, so we've never handled money in our lives. I did not know that was a large sum of money. She said, for me, it was just a number. And she said, but I know you said that you wanted to help. So if you can't afford to send $13,000, why don't you move to Ban Vinai and work with us and the refugee children? And my mother said, yes. She said to my father, I love you dearly. Do not worry, I will be back. She said to the school where she worked, I need to take a leave. And my sister was just graduating from college. And she said to my sister, how'd you like to go to a refugee camp on the Thai-Lao border? And off they went. And my mother told a wonderful story of arriving at the airport, and Sister Mater wasn't there. There were some other people there, and being put in the back of a truck, covered by tarp, driving all night, 12 hours over dark roads, bumpy roads, and thinking, I probably should have checked this out. But they arrived at Ban Vinai refugee camp, and Mom stayed for 3 months. My sister actually stayed for 6 months. They became bonded in a way that was as strong as any mother-daughter bond you'll ever see in your life, thanks to that experience. And my mother, mid-50s, came back, and she wanted to change her life. She gave notice at the school, and she became the founding director of what is now called the Women's Refugee Commission. It's an extraordinary organization formed on the auspices of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. And it was founded by two extraordinary women, Catherine O'Neill and Liv Ullman. And their first hire was my mother. And they hired her to found this organization. And my mother had discovered her second calling. And she spent the next almost 20 years traveling all over the world. And she traveled to Liberia many, many times. She traveled to Bosnia as it was being shelled. She traveled to Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire. She traveled to Burma and met Aung San Suu Kyi on one of the few months when she was sprung from house arrest. She traveled to East Timor during the war. She traveled all over, but one of the places she most frequently went was Afghanistan and Pakistan, especially to the tribal regions. And she fell in love with the countries and their people. And she had wonderful stories from her travels in the tribal regions. There was one night when she got stranded and had to spend the night alone in a guest house with 23 Mujahideen warriors. And I later said, Mom, weren't you scared to be sharing a guest house with 23 Mujahideen warriors? And she said, not at all. And then she added, but I think they were terrified of me. So going to refugee camps all over the world. Oh, by the way, it was in Afghanistan and Pakistan that she met that extraordinary woman, Nancy Hatch Dupree, which later led to her wanting to help her found this library. But wherever my mother went, she would ask the refugees what they needed, because part of the point was to give them their own voice and help them determine their fate. And of course, they always brought up health concerns, But the word that came up more than almost any other word was books. And for the refugees, with books, there was hope. But without books, there was none. So one of the stories I tell in my book is really the story of a miracle. And the miracle is how, working the phones from chemo, Mom connected with someone she hadn't seen since her own days at Harvard Radcliffe and managed to convince him to give $1 million to break ground on the library and to start funding these book box libraries. He had become reconnected with her, and he had one condition to his gift, which was that she stop working so hard on that project. And I think the only time I ever saw my mother break a promise was that one. And it's actually the story of another miracle, which is 2 days after Mom died, the US government gave $3 million, which was sufficient to build and complete the library. And about 3 weeks ago, the Library Research Cultural Center opened in Kabul, Afghanistan. And it's really one of the most beautiful buildings you've ever seen. It's a world-class library and research center. It's not an accommodation. It's something that they are so proud of. And also, there are now book box libraries in 200 villages in all 34 provinces of Afghanistan. And Mom did, before she died, get to see a video of the first book box library being delivered to the first group of girls and seeing them see the books for the first time ever in their life. And it's a thrilling piece of video. So that story is really just part of the book. At the center of the book is books. My mother taught me that reading is not the opposite of doing, that reading is the opposite of dying. That books are how we take part in the human conversation. And that books give us a common language to discuss the things that are most difficult to discuss and the things that are most important. And that books in whatever format, electronic, even though that wasn't for her, or audio, or printed, are how we know what to do in life and in the world. When I was growing up, my mother would never say to us, "Why don't you put down that book and do something?" For her, reading was doing something, and it was something huge. But Mom also believed that reading comes with great responsibility. If you read Khaled Hosseini, The Kite Runner, or A Thousand Splendid Suns, or I presume his new book, it's not enough to be moved. You have to then say to yourself, what am I going to do about Afghanistan? Doesn't have to be something huge. It can be to write a little check to an organization, to impress upon an elected official that this is a part of the world you care about, or even just to say, you know, when I see that big article in the New York Times, I'm not going to turn the page. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to try to understand. And Mom also felt that books were how you learned about human behavior, and that you had to act on that too. That when you read an author like Jhumpa Lahiri, a book like Interpreter of Maladies, or Unaccustomed Earth, or The Namesake, and you meet her characters, who are very often immigrants, with one foot in the land they came from and one foot here, who have children who have taken to America like a duck to water. When you read about those people, it's not enough to say, I feel their pain. You need to go out of your way to try to do just a little something. Maybe you're in a line somewhere and the person in front of you doesn't speak English particularly well, and maybe they never will. Can you help a little bit? Can you interpret, or can you at least just be a little bit patient as you stand behind them? That's what reading Jhumpa Lahiri, among all the joys, and I don't mean to reduce her to a kind of homily, because she's a brilliant literary writer, but at the very least, you need to do that, or maybe even something like, is there an immigrant family who you can invite to Thanksgiving? That kind of action can change a family's life and change the trajectory of a family and our world. So that's why I feel I'm not just on a book tour, I'm on a crusade, and I need your help. We all ask each other a lot of questions. How did you sleep? What do you want to have for dinner? Did you just cut in front of me in line? Or my favorite, are you going to eat that? But I want us to all start asking each other, one particular question a lot more often. And that question is this: what are you reading? It's a simple question, but it's a very profound one and a very powerful one, and it can change lives. One of the nicest messages I got about the book came from a woman who lived in Florida. And as is true of many people in Florida, she was a grandparent. And she told me a story about her relationship with her grandson, who did not live in Florida, and I think he was maybe 10 or 11. And she described how she would call him, and she would say, "What are you doing?" And he would say, "Nothing." And so, "Well, what did you have for dinner?" "Food." "How was school?" "Fine." And one day she decided to say to him, "What are you reading?" And he answered, "The Hunger Games." So this grandmother went to the local bookseller, bought a copy of The Hunger Games, and the next time she got on the phone with him, she was able to say, "Can you believe what Katniss did? And what did you think about this? And what did you think about that?" And they were off to the races. And she said it transformed their relationship, that they were no longer a grandmother and a grandson, but two readers on a journey. Now, I hope some of you will ask each other, what are you reading? I hope if it's not in your habit, you'll go home and ask people you love, what are you reading? And I also hope you'll just try springing it on the person in line in front of you, because you never know what they're going to say. And it's really exciting to find out either it's something you've read and you have something in common, or it's something you haven't. And then you have a way to grow and learn and figure out something new. I do want to mention the reason I called the book The End of Your Life Book Club. And it's because I really wanted to convey something I learned from Mom, which is we're all in end of our life book clubs. No one knows the last book we'll read, the last conversation we'll have. So the book is really a plea to make that count. Now I'm going to read a brief passage, and then we'll go to the Q&A portion of this. This is part of a chapter called The Uncommon Reader. By way of background, in January 2008, which was about 3 or 4 months after Mom was diagnosed, she and my father went to London. And London was a city that my parents loved dearly. My mother had been an acting student there in the 1950s. When she just graduated from college. And I was very lucky to grow up in a quasi-academic family. My parents were both administrators at Harvard, so we had an academic calendar, which meant we had good long summers, and very frequently the whole family would go to England. So I had spent a lot of time growing up in England. So here's the passage from the chapter called The Uncommon Reader. Keeping with our British theme, we next chose The Uncommon Reader, a novella by Alan Bennett that had been published 6 months earlier. It was fate that Mom would fall in love with it. How could she not? It was written by one of her favorite writers. It was set in London. It even involved the Queen of England. Also, how could anyone who loves books not love a book that is itself so in love with books? The day after we both finished the novella, I saw Mom at her home, and she pointed out to me her favorite passages. As always, she lifted her finger only when she was sure my eyes had found their way to the right portion. It was like the passing of a baton in a relay race. Here are the passages she pointed out to me. "Pass the time," said the Queen. "Books are not about passing the time. They're about other lives, other worlds. Far from wanting time to pass, one just wishes one had more of it. If one wanted to pass the time, one could go to New Zealand." And the second passage. The appeal of reading, the Queen thought, lay in its indifference. There was something undeferring about literature. Books did not care who was reading them, or even whether one read them or not. All readers were equal, herself included. Days after chatting with Mom about the Alan Bennett book, I saw her again at my niece's 4th birthday. By the time my partner David and I arrived, it was full-fledged happy chaos. And in the midst of it stood Mom. Her hair was definitely thinner. And even though the room was hot, Mom was wearing 2 layers of sweaters. Lucy, the birthday girl, was a little feverish, but was trying her darndest to have a great time at the party. And her grandmother was doing the very same thing. Everyone had warned Mom that as someone undergoing chemo, she shouldn't be around people with colds and shouldn't kiss or hug people hello or ride the subway or bus. But Mom wasn't going to live like that. So there she was in a scrum of children, about half of whom had runny noses and hacking coughs, completely in her element. After a while, though, I could see she was getting tired. She told me on the phone about the sores on her feet and how standing and walking weren't great. She broke away from the pack and came to join Dad and David and me. We talked about her trip to London. She and Dad had walked as much as she could to visit places she loved. She'd even gone back, she said, to see the house where she'd lived in the 50s. She'd seen her oldest godchild and his family, and his father and mother, friends from that first year she lived there. Her godson's mother was in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's, and Mom said she was amazed at the love and attention her family was giving her, as difficult as it must be. "I feel so lucky," Mom said to me. "I can't imagine what it would be like not to be able to know the people I love, or to read, or to remember books I've already read, or to visit my favorite places and remember everything that happened there, all the wonderful times." We watched Lucy play for a while and also chatted with her 7-year-old brother, Adrian, who was taking a brief break from his duties as the party's entertainment director. "The only thing that makes me really sad," said Mom, once Adrian had returned to the scrum, "is that I won't see the little ones grow up. I really wanted to take them all to Broadway musicals and on special trips, and to London." I realized then that for all of us, part of the process of Mom's dying was mourning not just her death, but the death of our dreams of things to come. You don't really lose the person who has been. You have all those memories. I would always have the summer in Godalming when I was 6 and learned to tie my shoe, and the performance of Giselle in London I'd seen with Mom, my first ballet ever, when Baryshnikov and Gelsey Kirkland danced so brilliantly they got 17 standing ovations, and Mom and I stood side by side with tears rolling down our faces because it was so thrilling. I would even have the times that seemed awful then, but looked hilarious now. Like when we arrived in Wales with no hotel reservation, and it was impossible to get a room, and we'd driven for hours with me vomiting prodigiously all over my siblings in the back seat. But we were all going to have to say goodbye to Mom taking her youngest grandchildren to a Broadway show, or to Harrods to marvel at the food hall and visit the pet store puppies. We were going to have to say goodbye to the little ones remembering their grandmother beyond a fleeting image or an imagined memory prompted by a photograph. We would need to say goodbye to Mom at their graduations, and to her buying them clothes, and to them bringing home boyfriends and girlfriends to meet her. We would also have to say goodbye to the joy of watching this next generation soak up the massive quantities of love their grandmother would have given them, and seeing them learn that there was someone in the world who loved them as much as their parents did. A grandmother who was delighted by all their quirks and who thought they were the most amazing creatures on earth. It was an idealized view of the future, but it was one I carried in my head, and I don't think it was far off from the one my brother and sister and father and mother had. I was learning this, that when you're with someone who's dying, you may need to celebrate the past, live the present, and mourn the future, all at the same time. Yet I had a thought then that made me smile. I would remember the books that Mom loved, and when the children were old enough, I could give those books to them and tell them these were books their grandmother loved. The littlest ones would never see the British Isles through her eyes, but they could see it through the eyes of the writers she admired. They would soon be old enough to read The Railway Children by Edith Nesbit, and Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransome, and eventually Iris Murdoch and Alan Bennett. They could all be readers, and maybe even uncommon ones. Thank you. And now I'd love to take any questions, hear books you love, chat. Yes?
Did you get to go to Kabul?
So the question is, did I get to go to Kabul? I thought about it, and then I thought something my mother had told me, which is, did they need me there? And the answer was no. And so I thought, if I can afford to go, and they don't need me, I should just send some money. And that I also worried that I would be a distraction, and that keeping me safe and looking after me would occupy their time when they could be doing other things. But at some point, I very, very much want to go and see the library. And the pictures, it has this beautiful courtyard, and it has wood and stone. It's such an important thing, I think, to build something not just adequate, but beautiful. And it's already, they've had programs and all sorts of things going on there. It's just great. Yes?
As a mother, I just have to make a comment that your mom would be so proud of what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
The other thing is, and I don't know if you want to answer this out loud, but I'm 3/4 of the way in the book, and I'm just wondering if at this point, has your faith increased?
Okay, that's a very good question. So one of the, I'm delighted. And one of the things I talk about, the themes in the book, is my mother was a very devout Presbyterian. She actually got married in a congregational church. Is it Greens Farm Congregational? Is that? Yep, that's where she got married, but she was a Presbyterian. And she had me baptized at Greens Farm Congregational. And her faith gave her enormous comfort and joy. It was an incredibly important part of her life. I went off to Episcopal boarding school, went to chapel 4 times a week for 4 years, and pretty much thought, well, that stores up enough chapel visits for the rest of my life. I'm done. And I describe myself as a lazy agnostic, in as much as I haven't even really given it terribly much thought. I talked about how our book club reading list was somewhat haphazard, but I did notice, which I comment on in the book, a little pattern emerging, which was my mother kept wanting to read books that had faith as a strong theme, like Gilead by Marilyn Robinson or Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot. There were various books that, so that was, Mom was inserting those books and constantly bringing up the topic. And I don't think she was trying to convert me in the way that people sometimes try to convert other people. I think it was such a joy to her that she wanted the same joy and comfort from me. The answer is, I may be a little more spiritual now, but I'm not. Nope. I'm not a churchgoer. Maybe that will change. But I'm a little more spiritual, I think. Thank you. Yeah. I think about them. I'm not so lazy anymore. I think about things a little more.
Your mother was such an extraordinary giving person, and I'm wondering, were her parents the same way, your grandparents?
It's a very good question. The first thing I should mention, I mentioned in the book, is her parents had, at least by the time she could recall it, an incredibly unhappy marriage and a very unpleasant divorce. So Mom grew up in, and it's not something she ever talked about with me or anybody, but she grew up in a very, very unhappy home. Her parents were both terrific people in their own way, and both very giving in various ways. My grandfather was very involved in Jewish charities. My grandmother was involved in local and community organizations. So she definitely, and my mother's grandmother was very active in all sorts of organizations, and they encouraged my mother as a young girl during World War II to be a candy striper at the local hospital. So Mom did have this, a family that was very committed, but I think what she did went way beyond. And I don't want to play amateur psychologist, but to some extent, the unhappiness of the house she grew up in, I think, determined some of the choices she decided to make with her life. Yes?
Reading the book, I was very impressed with the amount of books that you've read. You know, I consider myself a pretty good reader, but maybe 50, 75 books a year. But it's like you were describing, you're on a plane and you knock a whole book off, in a 10-hour flight. So I'd just be curious, how many books do you read a month a year, and how many mom reads. So I also recently read the Joe Queenan memoir.
Yes.
And his love of reading, that guy was like constantly reading, so.
And what are you reading now?
Oh, both great questions. So the book is a little, if you look at the back of the book, there's a list of all the books we read, and the books we talked about, and it's 150 something books. But actually the books that we read together and discussed over those 2 years was about 50 something. So that's really 2 books a month that we read and talked about together, which is a good clip, but not a crazy clip. Now, I did read a lot of other books during that time, and so did my mother. My perfect day is to wake up in the morning, not get out of bed until nature calls, start reading a book, and then really spend as little time out of bed as possible and keep reading until it's nightfall. I didn't do this as a stunt, I just realized ex post facto that one morning I had read The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway and The Moon Is Down by John Steinbeck that afternoon. So whenever given the opportunity, I'll do that, and then a week will go by and I won't read it all, and I'll watch The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and everything else. My mother was not a TV watcher, and she just read. One of her early jobs had been working for the producer Irene Selznick, and one of her roles was to read all the scripts that came in, so she had to become a very fast reader. And I worked in publishing for 21 years, and I had to become a very fast reader. So we both do, she did, and I do read at a kind of a terrific clip. I should also mention, for those of you who haven't read it, is one of my mother's peculiarities was she always read the end of a book first, which I don't do. She would be quite thrilled to know that a study just came out that said that people who read the ends of books first actually enjoy them more. Because they're not racing ahead to find out what happens next, they're stopping to savor the characters, the dialogue, and I'm a kind of race ahead to find out what on earth is going on sort of a person. So I think, does that sound, yeah. It's not, when you look at the thing, it seems like, could they have read 157 books together? And the answer is no. What am I reading now? My favorite question. So right at this very moment, I'm reading a book by Claire Massoud called The Woman Upstairs. Claire Massoud wrote Emperor's Children, The Emperor's Children. Did anyone here read The Emperor's Children? And this is her new book. I almost missed a radio interview this morning because I was totally fascinated with the book, and then it was like, oh my goodness, time to call into the radio station. I'm only about 30 pages in, but I'm really loving it. It's been a little controversial because it has a extremely unpleasant protagonist who's a woman. And some of the reviewers and some of the questions have said, is it fair, is it interesting for readers to read a book with an extremely unpleasant protagonist? And Claire pointed out, I think quite rightly, something of a double standard there, because there are plenty of great books by men with very unpleasant male narrators, Lolita, if you just wanted to name one. And she was a little curious as to why she was being asked this question, and it sparked a very interesting debate. But so far I'm enjoying that a lot. As far as books recently that I've loved, I loved a book by Ruth Ozeki called, anybody know? It's just gone out of my head. A Tale for the Time Being, about a writer on the Pacific Northwest coast, and a diary floats on shore, written by a 16-year-old girl in Japan who's thinking of killing herself. And she reads it and is trying to figure out what's going to happen. And the girl has a grandmother who's a Buddhist priest, and it's a marvelous, marvelous book. Complicated, it involves Schrodinger's cat, it involves Buddhist philosophy, but really worthwhile. And then I'll shut up in a minute. You get me going on this question, I can't stop. Two books that I read and was profoundly moved by, actually one was a middle grade reader, and one was a young adult book. The young adult book was The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Which is a book about two young people who meet at a cancer support group. And I think it has literally sold 1 million copies. And the other is a book called Wonder by R.J. Palacio. It's a great book. About a 5th grade boy who has a facial deformity who's getting up enough courage to go to school for the first time. And it's a book about choosing kindness. And it's just a marvelous book. And in England, they've actually published it both as a middle grade reader and an adult book simultaneously, because it can really be read by anybody of any age. Who's read Wonder here? What'd you think?
I thought it was wonderful, and it was interesting. One of my sons lives in Colorado, and my 13-year-old grandson got it as a 12 years old, got it as a Christmas gift. And his comment was, with the picture, and he knew what it was about, he didn't think he was going to read it. I came home, bought it immediately, and read it. And I asked him if he had read it, and that was right after the holidays. He had not. So
Interesting.
I have not followed up on that.
Oh.
But I thought it's an amazing story.
Amazing story. You also read it?
I did.
And what do you think?
I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah. And it's interesting, it's becoming part of school curriculums in anti-bullying efforts and to kind of spark that conversation. But those are some of the things that I've read recently. Yes?
Currently reading something light, don't know much about geography. I had your book on videotape, and much as Aaron opened with, I could not pull over, but I bought the book today to simply go through to get some of the names of those books, and I should have listened to your mother or my father and read the last book.
Because it's there.
Okay. Just two comments, one about audiobooks and one about your book. Some audiobooks are great. I wish that Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn would come out in audio. I thought that The Help was superior as an audio. 5 different Southern women's voices sparked my imagination. Your book, I love the fact anybody who's ever taken care of anybody at the end of their life, I thought the point that you made about don't ask them about their illness.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought that was profoundly moving and it just right on the mark. And what an extraordinary woman your mother was.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. The point, Mom, very early in her illness, after the diagnosis, her doctor actually suggested a book that Mom should give to all of us, which she did, and it is called The Etiquette of Illness by Sue Halpern. I think it's that. And it had, right on page 1, a piece of advice that was invaluable, which is instead of saying, how are you feeling, to say, do you want to talk about how you're feeling? And some days Mom would say, yes, I do. And some days she'd say, no, not today. Today I just want to get on with life, or today I've talked about it too much already, or today I just don't feel like talking about it. And I've taken that little piece of advice, and I actually try to apply it throughout my life now. And one of the ways I've been employing it is a lot of my friends' children are applying to colleges. All any adult seems to do is ask them about the college process. So instead of saying, where are you going to college, or any of those things, I say to them, do you want to talk about the whole college thing? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes, big smile, no, I really don't. And I think it's just great advice. One of the things I was really proud of is the book was out of print by the time my book came out, and secondhand copies were selling for between $300 and $400 because it's clear it's such a necessary book. Luckily, the publisher has now reprinted it, and it's available. And also, there's a wonderful book that's just come out that's a really nice companion to it by Letty Cotton Pogerben. And it's called How to Be a Friend to a Friend Who's Sick. And it has also wonderful common sense, terrific advice. And I say common sense advice, but usually nothing is less common than common sense. So it's advice. And she talks about something which I think is great, which is the idea of rehearsing. And that it's not a bad thing to rehearse what you're going to say to somebody. It keeps you from blurting out the really, really stupid things people very often say. I should add that, and this is just for me, it's very personal, I'm sure everybody is different. I cringe at some of the things I've said to people, but my real regrets were when I said nothing. Yes.
Are you aware that in Darien we have a wonderful organization for books called the Bookade?
No. What is it? Tell me about it.
Well, they ship books all over the world. I volunteered for them after my mother died. And you can buy postage to send books to Russia or Kabul or wherever you wish. So it's a wonderful way to remember someone or a birthday or whatever, to give books in their honor.
That's
And
great.
a lot of Peace Corps volunteers will email a list. It's a pure organization. Every cent goes to the philanthropy of sending library books. And Darien is very generous in their donations.
That's just terrific. What a wonderful. Do you know how that got started or who started that?
It was started after World War II.
Wow.
To supply books. But now it's worldwide that they ship. I think there was 71,000 pounds last year.
Good grief. That's wonderful. I'll look into that. Thank
And I know
you.
that they've sent to Kabul.
That's fantastic. Wow. Thank you.
The Bookade.
The Bookade. AID. Bookade. Thank you. Yes. Hi.
Shannon
Yes. Hi, Shannon.
from Discover. I am wondering, do you ever feel like, or do you feel obligated that to finish a book once you've started, or are you willing to put that book down if it's not grabbing you?
So, the whole finishing book thing. Well, you tell me first, Shannon. What's your? Do you feel obligated?
Well, in Discover or?
Just in general, in the life?
No, not at all. I feel like if it's just, I'll move on to the next.
Oh, can I see by raise of hands? How many are the feel obligated people? Okay. I used to be a feel obligated person, and then I don't anymore. But I will very often skim it to find out what happens. So I'll stop reading with any care whatsoever, and I'll give myself 15 minutes to flip through and see if I can kind of get a grip on it. I also, one of the things my mother decided and talked with me about in the book was she came to the conclusion that she didn't have time anymore for what she called silly books. And I tried to get her to define silly books. And it wasn't funny books, because we loved things like P.G. Wodehouse, and she had endless time for P.G. Wodehouse. It was books that she felt were not well written and had no values. And if she got to a book that was not well written and had no values, she put it down, and that was that. And I now apply the same criteria. If I'm reading a book and it's gimmicky, or it's the whole thing was written just because of some plot twist that the author thought up, and it's not about anything, and I don't care about the characters one way or another. I don't have to like them, I just have to care about them, or care about what they do. So I've put down a fair number of silly books recently. But I should say that a literary book can be just as silly as a genre book, and I love genre books. And one of the books I most loved last year was Gone Girl, which I just raced through. And I think that's actually a much more profound book than it's being given credit for. I think Gone Girl is actually the most cynical take on marriage that I've ever read, and is a real metaphor for the darkness that lies at the heart of many marriages, relationships. And I wish people would take that book more seriously. I mean, silly books, I think we all know. So those I really don't. Yes?
I was just curious, is there a thematic line that runs through the books that you chose vis-a-vis your mom? That was one question I had. Mm-hmm. It may have been occurred in retrospect rather than at the time.
Certain themes emerged. So one was the faith books that Mom was emerging. But I also think a thematic line that emerged is my mother and I both gravitated towards books about desperately unhappy people where things did not end well. Now, it may sound like a funny theme, but I think the word my editor made me cut from the book, half of the instances, because I'd used it so often, was the word lucky. So lucky still appears like a zillion times in my book, but it appeared 2 zillion times before my editor cut it. And one of the things that reading books about people who are way less fortunate than we are and were is that it kind of reminds me of that.
I have another question. I have this affinity for the classics. I keep rereading them. And I speak of modern classics.
Yes.
It seems that so much of what's being written has already been written in a much more complex, in-depth, universal characterization way. That sometimes when I pick up a book now, I say, I've read that before. Forget Shakespeare.
Yes.
Yeah. And the second question is, I have to hold a book in my hand. It's a strange thing. My grandchildren have told me, and my children, go get one of those iPads and help your eyes and all that stuff.
And you love it, right?
But I have books that I have accumulated over many, many years that I still go back to, whether it be Dumas or Eliot or whoever. And I like to hold them in my hand.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if there's something existential about the holding of a book and reading it and looking at an iPod or a pad.
Yeah. I think that is my answer is emphatically yes. There is something. And I've thought about it a lot, and for me, I've boiled it down to a couple of things. One is, I have an almost mystical belief that books find me when I need them most. And I will literally trip over, as in stub my toe over a book, and pick it up and open it to a passage. And it's the passage I need at that moment, or it's the book I need at that moment. Or I'll go to my bookshelf and I'll look, and I'll just go to a book and open it. Winston Churchill had a great phrase. He talked about visiting his books, and he would pull them off the thumb through them and put them back. And that can't happen with an electronic device. You have to go find a book on your electronic device. It doesn't appear to you. I jokingly said at one bookstore, but I was only somewhat joking. And but the book that I do have a superstition where in a bookstore, if I knock over a book, I have to buy it. Because it's the universe telling me I must read that book. And this bookstore is a great bookstore, Vero Beach Book Center in Vero Beach. Then jokingly told me they were going to place all of their books precariously on the edges of shelves whenever I came to visit. So that's one thing. Another thing is I collect first edition books. And you too. And I have a hard time describing to some people why. And then I figured out, at least for me, the reason is that this book came off the print line at the same time as the very first book that went to the author of that book. It's a sibling. And I just want to add one story, which is, I think, one of the most moving things that's happened to me since I published this book was a woman who knew my mother a little bit, but not well. Woman, great, one of the all-time great film music editors. Woman, I think she's in her 90 or close to 90 or early 90s, wrote me a letter saying how moved she was by the book, and she wanted to give me a gift. And she said, "You mustn't reject this gift." She said, it may seem like too much, but I want you to take this gift. And what the gift was a 1934 German edition of Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. And she wrote me a letter saying that she had this book as a little girl, she had it when she left Germany, and that she had carried it with her throughout her entire life. Even when she went away for a weekend, she took this book with her, and she wanted me to have it. Wow. And it's one of my most treasured possessions, and I just try to find an equivalent on a Kindle or an iPad. So that's my answer.
Answer one more question. What do you do with the books that you've read that are not first edition? I have trouble letting go of my books, and I have bookshelves all over my house, and I make myself every year give books to the library in our town for their book sale, but I still have an inordinate amount of books. I know at one time I'm going to have to go down in size of and I won't have room for all my books. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions.
I'll tell you a shameful story, and you will think me so profligate, and this is certainly a story I never would have shared with my mother because she thought I was pretty profligate as it was. So when we moved from a bigger place, my partner and me, to a smaller place, I put 100 boxes of books in storage because I just couldn't handle giving them away or selling them, but so I put them in storage. And it was about $100 a month for this storage place, which is expensive, but I thought I'll just deal with it in a couple months. 10 years have gone by. That's $1,200 a year. That's $12,000 to store 100 boxes of books. And what's worse is I don't even know what's there, so I keep buying the books that I already own. I finally got so ashamed of myself and the sheer horrible waste of this that I got two terrific young people to come with me, people with better backs than I have, and I sent all the books either to Housing Works or to friends. So I finally, and yet, will I probably do that again? The answer is yes. And that thing about tripping over books and having them stub you in the toe and let you know that you need to read them is because I have piles of books everywhere. And then the coffee table, I decided to take piles of books and put a big piece of glass on top of them. And my bedside table is stacked so precariously high with books that could just well do me in. I don't know what to do about this problem, so I wish I could help.
Okay. I was just wondering how you felt about inscriptions in books when you give them as a gift. I recently gave a book, and it was a first edition, and I hesitated to put an inscription in to the person I gave it to, but I was so wanting to because he graduated, you know.
Yes. So the book collector in me is very anti-inscription.
Yes.
Because when you're buying books for your collection, you really just want them signed.
Right.
There is a difference in what they refer to as an association copy. So if Thomas Mann signed it to William Faulkner, then that's good. If Thomas Mann signed it to Fred Faulkner, maybe not so much. Yeah, I mean, I've tried to get my godchildren going on first editions, and for them I just do signed copies. But I usually get them inscribed just because, unless you're going to be a serious book seller or a collector, the inscription can be really, really meaningful and lovely. So my answer, it depends.
Use a sticky note.
I actually put it on a card and put it inside the book.
That's a lovely thing. That's a really nice thing. The only thing, though, again, you want to tell is,
Lost, you know that.
is also if, as a book collector, it causes the paper to discolor differently.
Yes.
So if you can find a card stock that's on acid-free card, then you can write on that and stick it in and it won't cause discoloration. I clearly have too much time on my hands. I've thought about this stuff. Great. All right, well, thank you all very much.